It's 1814, and a chemist named Wilhelm Sattler has just created the most beautiful green pigment anyone has ever seen. Not the muddy, dull greens that fade in sunlight, not the expensive, verdant shades that only aristocrats can afford. This is Scheele's green, bright, vivid, emerald perfection, and it's cheap to manufacture. Within months, it's everywhere. Wallpaper, fabrics, artificial flowers, children's toys, candles, cake decorations. The Victorians are obsessed with it. One London interior designer calls it the colour of the age. There's just one problem nobody notices at first. It's made with arsenic. Lots of arsenic. And when that wallpaper gets damp, which in foggy, humid Victorian England happens constantly, it releases arsenic gas directly into your home. People are about to start dying in their sleep, and it'll take decades before anyone figures out why. Here's what made Scheele's green so revolutionary. Before its invention, creating bright green dyes required expensive processes and rare materials. You needed copper compounds, complicated chemical treatments, or actual ground-up minerals. Then the Industrial Revolution's chemical industry figured out how to synthesize copper arsenite cheaply. Suddenly, the most fashionable color of the era cost almost nothing to produce. Factory production meant economies of scale. A wallpaper manufacturer in Manchester could produce thousands of rolls of vibrant green wallpaper for the same cost as a few dozen rolls of traditional pigments. The price dropped by 80% in 5 years. And Victorians were desperate for it. This was the height of the Victorian obsession with nature, Gothic revival, and botanical motifs. Green represented everything fashionable: gardens, the countryside, growth, life, sophistication. Middle-class families could finally afford to decorate like the wealthy. Green wallpaper became a status symbol that was actually accessible. If you had a parlor without green wallpaper or green fabric by 1830, you were behind the times. Manufacturers created elaborate patterns: ivy crawling up walls, ferns unfurling across ceilings, emerald damask in dining rooms. The more popular it became, the more arsenic entered British homes. But here's the engineering problem nobody anticipated. Wallpaper isn't inert. It's paper, paste, and pigment, all organic materials that interact with their environment. In damp conditions, mold grows on wallpaper paste. That mold, feeding on the paste, converts the copper arsenite into trimethylarsine, an arsenic gas. Colorless, nearly odorless, toxic. Victorian homes were perfect incubators. Poor ventilation, coal fires creating condensation, no central heating, constant dampness from London fog. The more fashionable your green wallpaper, the more likely your walls were slowly poisoning you. Doctors started noticing patterns in the 1830s, but they attributed symptoms to bad air or miasmas. The germ theory of disease didn't exist yet. Nobody thought to suspect the wallpaper. Let me tell you about the Foods family of Liverpool. In 1862, they redecorated their townhouse with expensive green damask wallpaper in every major room. Within 6 months, all 4 children were chronically ill. The symptoms seemed random at first: headaches, nausea, painful skin rashes. The youngest daughter, Elizabeth, developed a chronic cough. Their doctor diagnosed nervous exhaustion and prescribed rest and fresh air. But here's the thing: whenever they sent the children to stay with relatives in the countryside, they recovered. The moment they returned home, symptoms came back within days. Nobody suspected the wallpaper. Why would they? Wallpaper wasn't food or medicine. It was just decoration. The Foods weren't isolated. Medical journals from the 1850s-60s are full of mysterious cases. Entire households falling ill with similar symptoms, children dying of wasting diseases, adults developing neurological problems that doctors couldn't explain. One physician in London documented a cluster of deaths in a single neighborhood. 7 children under age 10, all in homes decorated with green wallpaper, all dying of respiratory failure within an 18-month period. He noted it as a curiosity, but didn't make the connection. The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning are insidious, not dramatic enough to scream poison, but devastating over time. Peripheral neuropathy, numbness in hands and feet, skin lesions, hair loss, weakness, confusion. Victorians attributed these to everything from tuberculosis to moral failings to weak constitutions. Some victims described a faint garlic smell in their bedrooms at night. That was the arsenic gas. But in an era of coal smoke, gas lamps, and poor sanitation, one more unpleasant smell didn't register as alarming. Workers in wallpaper factories had it worst. They handled arsenic compounds directly, often without any protection. A factory girl named Mary Ann Cotton, not the famous poisoner, different person. Workers in wallpaper factories had it worst. They handled arsenic compounds directly, often without any protection. A factory girl named Mary Ann Cotton, not the famous poisoner, different person, worked in a Manchester wallpaper factory for 3 years. By age 19, she had lost most of her hair, had severe tremors, and could barely walk. The factory doctor said she had hysteria. She'd been breathing arsenic dust 8 hours a day. The cruelest part: parents decorated nurseries with green wallpaper because it was cheerful and nature-themed. Children, smaller and more vulnerable to toxins, were sleeping in rooms that were essentially gas chambers. And because arsenic poisoning symptoms overlap with dozens of common Victorian-era illnesses, the deaths just blended into the background noise of high mortality rates. The first person to publicly sound the alarm was a chemist named William Hines in 1857. He tested popular wallpapers and found that some contained up to 3 grams of arsenic per square meter, enough to kill someone if you scraped it off and ate it. He published his findings. The wallpaper industry responded by calling him a fearmonger. Because here's the problem: the wallpaper industry was enormous. By 1860, British factories produced over 20 million rolls of wallpaper annually, much of it green. Thousands of jobs depended on it. Entire factory towns existed solely to manufacture wallpaper. When Hines suggested banning arsenic pigments, manufacturers argued that the arsenic was bound in the pigment and couldn't harm anyone. They hired their own chemists to produce studies showing the wallpaper was safe. It took a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele, yes, the same Scheele from Scheele's Green, to prove them wrong in 1859. He demonstrated that damp wallpaper releases arsenic gas. He published detailed chemical analyses. The industry didn't budge. Instead, they shifted tactics. They claimed that only poorly ventilated rooms were dangerous, and that proper British homes with good airflow had nothing to worry about. Translation: if your wallpaper poisoned you, it was your fault for not having adequate ventilation. Newspapers took opposing sides. Some called for bans. Others ran industry-sponsored articles claiming the danger was exaggerated. The British Medical Journal published evidence of arsenic poisoning in 1862. Popular decorating magazines dismissed it as hysteria. This went on for years. Meanwhile, people kept dying. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Napoleon Bonaparte's death. When Napoleon died in exile in 1821, historians later analyzed samples from his wallpaper. It was green. It was loaded with arsenic. And his documented symptoms before death, hair loss, weakness, stomach problems, matched arsenic poisoning. The revelation that arsenic wallpaper might have contributed to Napoleon's death made headlines in the 1870s and 1880s. Suddenly, the threat felt real to the public in a way that anonymous working-class deaths hadn't. Manufacturers finally began phasing out arsenic pigments, not because of regulations, those came much later, but because consumer demand collapsed. Nobody wanted the Napoleon wallpaper in their home. By 1900, arsenic-based pigments were rare, but it took another 30 years for some manufacturers to fully abandon them. Here's the lasting impact. The arsenic wallpaper crisis was one of the first times the public confronted the idea that everyday industrial products could be invisibly dangerous. Before this, poison was something you ate or drank intentionally or by accident. The idea that your home decorations could slowly kill you without you knowing, that was new and terrifying. It led to the first consumer protection movements. People started demanding to know what was in the products they bought. "What's this made of?" became a legitimate question instead of paranoia. The wallpaper industry's denials, cover-ups, and hired scientists created the template for every corporate public health scandal that followed. Tobacco companies denying cancer links, lead paint manufacturers dismissing toxicity concerns, asbestos producers insisting their product was safe. It also accelerated the development of toxicology as a science. Doctors learned to look for environmental causes of illness, not just infectious diseases or moral failings. The concept of chronic low-level exposure entered medical thinking, and it changed how we think about industrial progress. The Victorians believed that new manufacturing techniques were automatically better, cheaper, more colorful, more accessible. These were unquestionable goods. Arsenic wallpaper taught them that industrial chemistry could create dangers that didn't exist in nature, that mass production could distribute those dangers faster than anyone could track, that cheap and beautiful might have hidden costs measured in lives. Today, we have chemical safety regulations, material safety data sheets, consumer protection agencies, entire bureaucracies dedicated to making sure your wallpaper won't kill you. All because the Victorians loved green. The real irony: Scheele, who invented the pigment, warned about arsenic's toxicity from the beginning. He knew it was poisonous. But in the rush to capitalize on the Industrial Revolution's chemical manufacturing capabilities, everyone ignored him. They wanted the color. They didn't want to think about the cost. Every time you check an ingredient list, every time you research whether a product is toxic, every time you demand to know what your home is made of, you're living in the world that arsenic wallpaper created. The Victorians just wanted fashionable interior design. They accidentally invented the modern concept of consumer safety.